48 hours, not 60 days. Not the review provision's complex legal architecture whose 60-day countdown the Iranian legal team built into the deal's technical annexes to provide the procedural timeline, whose simultaneous operation with the compound pressure strategy, the IRGC Command Council, designed to produce the compound pressure whose dimensions the implementation period's legal, nuclear, economic, and military pressure simultaneously generated. Not the time window the air defense darkness opened, not the 93 minutes the cyber electromagnetic operation required to restore both Hormuz corridors, not the 12 seconds China's bilateral channel needed to confirm the most hidden nuclear site's wipeout and coordinate 4 simultaneous implications. Not the 45 seconds China needed to confirm the 440-kilogram transit as the surrender mechanism's execution. Not the 8 seconds the bilateral channel required to respond to the new bunker buster's unknown elimination. 48 hours, Trump's most recent Truth Social post. 6 sentences, whose precision the behavioral record documents as operational rather than rhetorical in the specific way, the 43 words, and the 107 words, and the will no longer exist post, and the 60-day clock, and the 1,000 missiles threat have each demonstrated through the specific compliance behaviors their precision produced. The post was published at 7:31 a.m. The 6 sentences said the following: Iran has 48 hours to complete the process it started. The uranium goes to the IAEA now. The assembly meets and signs. The missiles are addressed in the framework we agreed. The people in the bunkers know what comes next if 48 hours produces nothing. This is the last clock I set. 6 sentences. The last clock I set. The last clock changes everything about what the 48 hours means. Not the first clock. Not the 43 words, or the 60-day clock, or the 1,000 missiles, or will no longer exist, or any of the preceding ultimatums whose specific language and compliance timelines the behavioral record has documented as the compellence architecture's successive iterations. The last clock. The specific communicative assertion that the 48 hours is not another step in the compellence architecture's progressive application, but the compellence architecture's final application, whose completion or failure produces the endpoint rather than the next step. The last clock, I said. These 5 words are the most consequential single phrase the conflict's entire 18 months have produced. More consequential than will no longer exist. More consequential than 1,000 missiles. More consequential than the 43 words operational precision, or the 107 words GBU 57s are loaded, or the 60-day clock's missiles they refuse to discuss. More consequential because the last clock's assertion is not a threat. It is a termination. The termination of the compellence architecture's iterative application in the specific form that acknowledges the iteration has reached its endpoint, and the 48 hours outcome determines whether the endpoint is the resolution or the alternative, whose characterization the last clock's being last implies. Here's what the 6 sentences mean in the specific analytical context of the resolution trajectory's most advanced phase. Here's what the 48 hours production requires from every institution whose participation the endpoint's achievement demands. Here is what the last clock's 48 hours produces if the completion occurs, and what it produces if the completion does not occur, and why both scenarios' production is different from anything the preceding compellence architecture's iterations produced, because the last clock's being last makes the difference categorical rather than incremental. And here is why the 48 hours that began at 7:31 a.m. is the most consequential single-time window the conflict's 18 months have produced, because the window's closure produces the endpoint, whose arrival the accumulated 18 months of strikes and ultimatums and deals and violations and traps and recoveries and ship attacks and powerful strikes and 1,000 missile threats and Dark Eagle deployments and direct negotiations and Day 4 rejections and Supreme Leader installations and assassination operational plannings and taking overs and FBI director emails and approval crashes and 9 consecutive nights and leaked memos and power grid failures and Hormuz closures and bunker busters and satellite catches and convoy formations and air defense collapses and self-trapped navies and leaked Pentagon documents and new bunker busters have been building toward, in the specific terminal form, the last clock's being last defines. The 6 sentences analytical decomposition requires understanding what each sentence addresses in the context of the resolution trajectory's most advanced phase, and why the combination of all 6 in the same 6-sentence post at 7:31 a.m. produces the last clock's characterization as the operational assertion, the behavioral record documents, as the compellence architecture's termination. The first sentence. Iran has 48 hours to complete the process it started. Not to start a process. To complete a process Iran started. The process Iran started is the negotiated transitions implementation through the clerical channel and the Assembly of Experts procedural convening request, and the Foreign Ministry's alternative pathway communication and the behavioral indicators whose production Tabe's repositioned network's clerical channel delivery has been confirming in the collection architecture's monitoring. The first sentence acknowledges that Iran has started the process, not the resistance narrative's external performance, the negotiated transitions implementation. The 48 hours is the completion timeline for the process Iran started. The second sentence. The uranium goes to the IAEA now, not in the procedural timeline the Assembly's invocation mechanism's formal process produces now. The 1,340 kilograms whose transit the 3:22 a.m. satellite catch confirmed, and the IAEA inspectors at the handover point are waiting to receive, and the Assembly's invocation documentation in the procedural channel is advancing toward producing the custody transfer. The second sentence is the specific instruction whose now characterization accelerates the Assembly's invocation mechanism's procedural timeline in the direction the 48 hours completion condition requires. The third sentence. The Assembly meets and signs. The Assembly of Experts whose procedural convening request the Planning Memorandum's second terms mechanism specifies, and whose 4-hour 17-minute session installed the new Supreme Leader, and whose foundational document's peaceful civilian application provision the second term's uranium surrender mechanism invokes. The Assembly meets and signs, not the Assembly's procedural channel's advancement through the timeline the procedural process specifies. Meets and signs. The 48 hours, second completion condition, is the Assembly's meeting and signing. The fourth sentence. The missiles are addressed in the framework we agreed, not the massive hidden loopholes closure that the 60-day clock's missile inclusion demanded, and the Joint Technical Commission's 40-minute rejection confirmed would not be addressed through the Commission's working group process. The framework we agreed is the Joint Statements Enforcement Framework, whose Chapter 7 backing China's bilateral channel and France's standing statement, and the Senate's unanimous assessment and the bilateral defense agreement's activations have been developing the institutional weight for throughout the conflict's implementation period. The missiles are addressed in the framework we agreed. The fourth sentence is the specific instruction whose framework we agreed. Characterization acknowledges the Joint Statements Enforcement Framework as the mechanism rather than the deal's excluded missile program's separate renegotiation. The fifth sentence. The people in the bunkers know what comes next if 48 hours produces nothing, not the threat's characterization that will no longer exist. And 1,000 missiles and the compellence architecture's preceding iterations have each provided as the specific consequence whose occurrence the compliance behavior's production would prevent. The people in the bunkers know. The fifth sentence is not the threat. It is the acknowledgement that the threat has already been communicated and received and understood in the specific form that the new bunker, Buster's unknown wiping out, and the 9:14 p.m. air defense network's complete darkness, and the GBU-57's Fordo employment's seismic registration, and the Dark Eagle's first combat employment, and the Joint American-Chinese Naval Convoy Formation, and the IRGC Navy's 6:33 a.m. self-trap, have collectively produced as the operational evidence in the bunker's occupants' personal survival calculation. The sixth sentence. This is the last clock I set. The compellence architecture's termination in the specific first-person communicative assertion that the iterative applications being last is not the next step's threat, but the endpoint's definition. The last clock I set is the assertion that 48 hours is not another ultimatum in the iterative sequence, but the iteration's termination, whose completion or failure produces the endpoint rather than the next ultimatum. 6 sentences at 7:31 a.m. The last clock. 48 hours. China's bilateral channel response to the 7:31 a.m. post arrived in 4 seconds. 4 seconds. Not the 8 seconds for the new bunker buster's unknown elimination. Not the 12 seconds for the most hidden nuclear sites wiped out characterization. Not the 17 seconds for the IRGC Navy's 6:33 a.m. self-trap. Not the 25 seconds for the air defense network's complete darkness. Not the 30 seconds for the hidden uranium's transit confirmation. Not the 45 seconds for the 440 kilogram vanishing. Not the 60 seconds for the Joint American-Chinese Naval Convoy Formation's activation. 4 seconds. The bilateral channel's fastest single response in the conflict's entire 18-month duration. 4 seconds. Because the bilateral channel's monitoring had been anticipating the last clock's arrival since the new bunker buster's 4:11 a.m. employment produced the unknown unknown's elimination, that China's 8 seconds identified as the most significant single development for the 5 terms completion's timeline. The anticipation produced the specific institutional preparation, whose completion before the last clock's 7:31 a.m. arrival enabled the 4-second response whose content the preparation had been producing since the 8-second response's final coordination. The 4-second response said the following: China fully supports the 48-hour completion timeline. China is immediately activating every bilateral channel mechanism for the Assembly's meeting and signing within the 48 hours. China is coordinating with the IAEA's technical team to receive the 1,340 kilograms custody transfer at the handover point within the 48 hours. China is implementing the framework we agreed provisions for the missile programs addressing within the 48 hours. China is maintaining the joint American-Chinese naval convoy formation's presence in both Hormuz corridors for the 48 hours duration. China is maintaining the Strategic Petroleum Reserve's maximum emergency release for the 48 hours duration. China is requesting France's bilateral channel inclusion in the 48-hour coordination, whose standing statement at the Security Council's official record, France's institutional position, has established as the European component the coordination requires. And China is communicating to the Supreme Leader through every available channel, including the clerical channel, that the 48 hours is the completion timeline whose production the institutional survival calculations' preferred output requires in the environment the accumulated developments have created. 8 simultaneous actions, 4 seconds. The bilateral channel's most comprehensively coordinated 4-second response the conflict has produced. The IRGC Command Council's direct CENTCOM communication through the military-to-military channel that the leaked Pentagon document predicted as the next move before it happened had been scheduled for the 48 hours after the leaked document's appearance on the platforms the 40-person distribution list was not supposed to reach. The last clock's 7:31 a.m. publication has accelerated the scheduled timings assessment in the IRGC Command Council's planning architecture because the last clock's 48 hours and the scheduled direct CENTCOM communications timing are now in the same 48-hour window. The scheduled direct CENTCOM communication is the IRGC Command Council's institutional acknowledgement of the self-trap's no way out and the 5 terms preferred output and the institutional survival calculations thresholds reaching. The last clock's 48 hours is the completion timeline whose production the scheduled communication was designed to initiate through the military-to-military channel's direct contact, both in the same window. The institutional timing alignment whose occurrence the last clock's publication has produced. The Senate's response to the 7:31 a.m. post produced the specific legislative environment's most consequential single development since the unanimous assessment to the assassination operational planning's intelligence briefing content generated. The Senate Majority Leader's announcement at 8:47 a.m. that the chamber is suspending all pending votes on Iran-related legislation for the 48-hour window, whose completion or failure will determine the legislative posture the chamber's institutional role requires it to adopt in response to the endpoint's production. Suspension of pending votes. The specific legislative action whose institutional significance is the chamber's acknowledgement that the 48 hours production supersedes the pending votes legislative process in the specific way that the endpoint's 48-hour proximity makes the vote's political cost-benefit calculation superseded by the endpoint's direct determination of the posture the completion or failure requires. The Senate is waiting for the 48 hours. The chamber, whose unanimous assessment and complex vote calculations and classified briefings and authorization pathways completion and legislative deliberations extended timeline, have been the domestic political environment's institutional processing mechanism throughout the conflict's 18 months, is waiting for the 48 hours to produce the outcome that determines the posture the chamber's institutional role requires. France's bilateral channel response to China's 4-second coordination request arrived in 6 minutes. The 6 minutes reflects France's institutional processing of the 48-hour completion timeline's inclusion request against the Standing Statement's Security Council official record and the France-China bilateral relationship, whose specific character the direct look at the Chinese permanent representative had publicly documented. The 6-minute response confirmed France's participation in the 48-hour coordination, whose Standing Statement's official record France's institutional position has established, and whose European component the coordination requires for the comprehensive international institutional support the 48 hours completion needs to produce the endpoint rather than the alternative. The IAEA Director General's response to China's 4-second coordination's custody transfer request arrived in 7 minutes. The 7 minutes reflects the IAEA's institutional processing of the 1,340 kilograms custody transfer's 48-hour timeline against the technical team's current positioning at the handover point and the radiation monitoring asset's post-strike coverage of the new bunker busters' unknown eliminations dispersion signatures and the procedural channel's assembly invocation documentation's advancement status. The 7-minute response confirmed the technical team's readiness to receive the 1,340 kilograms custody transfer at the handover point within the 48 hours, and the IAEA Director General's classification of the custody transfer's receipt as the organization's highest operational priority. The IRGC Command Council's direct CENTCOM communication arrived at 9:47 a.m., 2 hours and 16 minutes after the last clock's 7:31 a.m. publication. Through the military-to-military channel, whose operational safety precedent, the deconfliction information exchanges, and the bilateral consultations coordination, and the joint operational consultation had established throughout the conflict's implementation period. The communications content is the institutional communication the leaked Pentagon document predicted as the next move before it happened. The content acknowledged the self-trap's no way out. It acknowledged the 5 terms preferred output as the institutional survival calculation's conclusion in the environment the accumulated developments have produced. It requested the specific operational assistance whose provision the self-trap's safe resolution requires, including the acoustic mine network's safe deactivation guidance, and the autonomous underwater vehicle swarm's recovery coordination and the electromagnetic pulse emitter network's safe shutdown protocol. And it indicated the IRGC Command Council's institutional readiness to facilitate the 5 terms completion within the last clock's 48-hour timeline. CENTCOM's response to the direct communication arrived in 3 minutes. The prior knowledge, the leaked Pentagon document's appearance on the platforms, the 40-person distribution list was not supposed to reach produced for CENTCOM's institutional response preparation, enabling the 3-minute response the unexpected receipts assessment cycle would not have produced in the same timeline. The 3-minute response confirmed CENTCOM's coordination with the Chinese naval convoy formation for the acoustic mine network's safe deactivation guidance and the autonomous underwater vehicle swarm's recovery coordination and the electromagnetic pulse emitter network's safe shutdown protocol. The response also confirmed CENTCOM's institutional acknowledgement of the IRGC Command Council's 5 terms completion facilitation within the 48 hours. The military-to-military channel has produced the direct communication the leaked Pentagon document predicted. CENTCOM has responded in 3 minutes. The safe deactivation coordination is active. The 5 terms completion facilitation is acknowledged. The 48-hour clock is running. The clerical channel's delivery to the institutional decision-maker of the 7:31 a.m. post's last clock characterization, and China's 4-second simultaneous 8 action coordination, and the IRGC Command Council's direct CENTCOM communication. And CENTCOM's 3-minute response confirmation is the clerical channel's most consequential single delivery since the conflict began. The institutional decision-maker, whose telecommunications infrastructure the taking over disrupted, and whose clerical channel communication the disruption has not eliminated, is receiving through the clerical channel the complete picture of the 48-hour window whose every element is simultaneously present and advancing in the direction the 5 terms completion requires. The Assembly's invocation documentation is advancing in the procedural channel. The 1,340 kilograms is in transit toward the handover point where the IAEA's technical team is positioned to receive the custody transfer. The joint statements framework we agreed, provisions for the missile program's addressing, are being implemented through the bilateral channel's coordination. The safety activation of the self-trap's 3 elements is being coordinated through the military-to-military channel's direct CENTCOM communications response. The air defense network's darkness is the clock. The clear shot exists. The new bunker buster's unknown elimination has changed the nuclear security picture's worst-case scenario's characterization. The people in the bunkers know what comes next. The last clock is running. 48 hours from 7:31 a.m. Every institutional mechanism is advancing simultaneously. The clerical channel is carrying the complete picture. The Assembly is convening. The IAEA is positioned. The IRGC is facilitating. CENTCOM is coordinating. China responded in 4 seconds. France confirmed in 6 minutes. The Senate is waiting. The Senate Majority Leader suspended the pending votes. The last clock I set. 48 hours. What happens next could change everything. Not as the rhetorical assertion that conflict coverage produces when events approach the conclusion, whose arrival the accumulated pressure has been building toward, as the specific operational and institutional characterization of a 48-hour window whose production of the 5 terms completion or the alternative's execution constitutes the 18 months of accumulated conflict's endpoint in one of the 2 forms whose distinction the 48 hours production determines. The completion. The endpoint is the negotiated transition's 5 terms completion through the Assembly's meeting and signing and the uranium's custody transfer, and the missile program's addressing in the framework we agreed, and the governance transition's phased restoration and the economic normalization's sequenced implementation. The completion changes everything in the direction the accumulated 18 months of compound pressure and direct negotiations and leaked memos and satellite catches and convoy formations and bunker busters and self-trapped navies and last clocks were building toward. The alternative, the endpoint is what the people in the bunkers know comes next when the last clock produces nothing. The alternative changes everything in the direction the 1,000 missiles and will no longer exist, and the full options briefs 140 targets and the clear shot, and the new bunker busters unknown finding capability describe. 48 hours. Both outcomes are possible. One is the preferred. The institutional survival calculation's preferred output. The clerical channel's way through, the 5 terms completion, the endpoint. The The 18 months of accumulated pressure were designed to eventually make the preferred outputs production possible in the specific institutional environment whose construction the conflict has been building throughout its entire duration. The last clock is running. What happens next in the 48 hours will change everything. The assembly is convening, the uranium is in transit, the IAEA is positioned, CENTCOM received the direct communication, the safety activation is coordinating, China's 4 seconds has activated 8 simultaneous mechanisms, France's 6 minutes confirmed European coordination, the Senate is waiting, the clerical channel is delivering the complete picture. The institutional decision maker is processing the last clock's 48 hours in the complete picture the clerical channel's delivery has produced. 48 hours from 7:31 a.m., the last clock I set. What happens next could change everything. The completion or the alternative, the preferred output or what the people in the bunkers know comes next, the clerical channel's way through or the endpoint the accumulated pressure's alternative produces. The clock is running. Drop a comment right now and tell us what you think. The 48 hours produces in the environment where every institutional mechanism is simultaneously advancing toward the 5 terms completion, and the IRGC Command Council's direct CENTCOM communication has acknowledged the self-trap's no way out, and the 5 terms preferred output, and the institutional survival calculations thresholds reaching. And CENTCOM has responded in 3 minutes, and China activated 8 mechanisms in 4 seconds, and France confirmed in 6 minutes, and the Senate suspended pending votes, and the Assembly is convening, and the uranium is in transit, and the IAEA is positioned, and the new bunker busters' unknown elimination has changed the nuclear security picture, and the people in the bunkers know what comes next. Does the last clocks being last change the institutional decision-maker's processing of the clerical channel's complete picture delivery in the specific direction, whose significance is the difference between another iterative compellent step and the endpoint's production in the 48 hours, whose completion or failure defines the endpoint's form? Tell us what you think the 48 hours produces. Share this with everyone following the situation, because Trump giving Iran 48 hours in the last clock he sets is the moment the conflict's entire accumulated 18 months of pressure and compliance and violation and escalation and self-defeat and surrender in transit and clerical channels and 5 terms and assembly invocations and new bunker busters and direct military communications and 4-second bilateral responses have been building toward, in the 48 hours production of the completion or the alternative is the endpoint whose arrival changes everything in one of the 2 directions the last clocks being last defines. The clock is running, 48 hours. What happens next could change everything.